to delve into your own personal history to begin with. Where did you spend Christmas in the year 1978? Boney M. had the Christmas #1 with Mary's Boy Child. And the Morecambe and Wise Christmas special on ITV for the first time had guest appearances by Leonard Rossiter, Eamon Andrews, Nicholas Parsons, and believe it or not, Harold Wilson. Does that help? It's actually an easy question for me to answer. It was my second Christmas on the island of Sandy in Orkney, my first parish as a minister. I'd been there since July 1977, and it was also my first Christmas as a dad. So that made it a very special time. Malcolm Caldwell, our subject for this evening, was looking forward eagerly to spending Christmas with his family in 1978, but it didn't happen. On the night before he was due to fly home from Cambodia, the 23rd of December, he was murdered. Who he was, how he connects with Kirkcudbright, why his memory is either venerated or execrated with nothing much in between, what he was doing in Cambodia, and who was responsible for his murder are all questions that Gerry and I will explore this evening, although I'm not promising definitive answers to all of them, especially not the last one. But before we begin, I need to say that for me, this is more than local history, it's more than political history, this is family history. Malcolm Caldwell was my mother's cousin. Her mother and his mother were sisters, and that makes me his first cousin once removed, I believe. And I want to take a little time to go through that relationship, not least to knock on the head a very persistent bit of fake news that's associated with Malcolm Caldwell. Wrong way. That's me on the right. And my grandma. She died when I was 5, and I don't think this could have been much before that. I was her first grandchildren. She spoiled me. I was very, very fond of her. Here's a simplified family tree. The old rascal at the top, David Sutherland, was from Lather & Wheel in Caithness. He left there to come south and find work in the foundries of Falkirk. But that's not the only reason he left Caithness. He had fathered 2 illegitimate children in the same year by 2 different women. One was with Isabella Munro, whom, as you see there, he eventually married. The other one resulted in a paternity suit against him. Caithness became too hot to hold him. David and Isabella had 5 further children, and they're all listed there. Their son Ben, who I only had 5 boxes, so he's lumped in with David. He was a director of Stennismuir Football Club, and I'm told he shared in the organisation of the first floodlit football match in Scotland. And then after Ben, there were 4 daughters. My grandmother, Elizabeth, Christina, Isabella, and Violet Jane. And I'm sorry to have to tell you that within the family, they were known as Liz, Chris, Tib, and Pans. Pans was short for pansy, and I'm told that Violet Jane hated being called that, and I don't blame her. She married a man called Archie Caldwell in 1928 in Larbert. Archie Caldwell was born in Bothkenner, north of Falkirk, in 1900. And at the age of 14, he'd been articled to a firm of architects just after the start of World War I. His apprenticeship was interrupted when his boss was called up for war service, so he moved to another office before he himself was called up in May 1918. He finally got back to his apprenticeship and completed it under his original boss in 1920. And that boss, Alexander Malcolm, seems to have taken a liking to young Master Caldwell, because when he took on a post as architect for Stirling County Education Authority, Archie Caldwell was one of the first appointments he made. Throughout the 20s and 30s, as well as a wife, Archie gained experience, additional qualifications, and 3 children, Isabel, Malcolm, and David, all born in Stirling. And Malcolm seems to have been named after his dad's mentor in architecture, Alexander Malcolm. He's James Alexander Malcolm Caldwell. At some point before 1939, Archie successfully applied for the post in the County Architect's office in Kirkcudbright, and he became the County Architect in 1950. I don't know what this group of people might have been, and I'd be very grateful for any enlightenment that anyone can offer.
It's the Rotary.
No, it's not the Rotary, but that's Archie Caldwell there. And here's a not very sharp blow-up of a man with very big ears. This is a record of his career from the Scottish Dictionary of Architects, and you can see that from the age of 14, apart from that war service, he was continually employed in architecture until his death. And among the buildings for which he was responsible are some that will be familiar to you. The council offices. Isn't it beautiful? The old Dalbeattie School, now demolished. And number 2 Bourtry Avenue, which was the family home, I believe. In 1950, it was a momentous year for him and for me. I was born then. He became the 3rd president of Kirkcudbright Rotary Club. And there's a photo in the Selkirk of the founder members. Sadly, he's not in it, but his name is on the president's collar. And that was just a few years before his somewhat early death at the age of 56 in April 1957, meaning that he missed out on his home team winning the Scottish Cup in the following month, poor soul. This is a copy of the registration of his death, which you won't be able to read. I've been told he was a heavy smoker, and I wondered if that was the cause of his death. But he actually died of stomach problems. He had a partial gastrectomy 7 days before he died, and peritonitis 3 days later. And here is the family gravestone in the cemetery up the hill there, which records Archie, Violet Jane, and the 3 children. We're not actually certain that they're all buried there, but their names are all recorded. I've gone through Archie Caldwell's career in a bit of detail because there's a persistent untruth that appears in a lot of the stories of Malcolm Caldwell. Here's a headline from the Daily Record. Scots miner's son was first Westerner to interview Pol Pot and was killed hours later. Here's a reference to a biography. He was born in Scotland on September 27th, 1931, in a coal miner's family. And here's the note about him on Kirkcudbright Academy's website. And you'll see the bit in black there, the son of a coal miner. Now, if anyone should know better, it should be Kirkcudbright Academy, when he lived just up the road in the house built by an architect. But they still record that. Maybe being the son of a miner gives you good, solid left-wing roots, which being the son of an architect doesn't. But it's an absolute invention, and it kind of annoys me. He did have a connection with the mining industry. His father worked in the Stirlingshire mines as a pit inspector, and we think that that is... Sorry, that's Archie Caldwell's father, Malcolm's grandfather. But Archie's CV, as you've seen, doesn't allow any time for employment as a miner. I'm glad to say that currently Wikipedia correctly identifies him as the son of an architect. It used to say miner. I corrected it, and then that correction was deleted, allegedly because of lack of evidence. It's now been put right again, and if anyone wants to dispute it, lying on the table over there is Malcolm Caldwell's birth certificate. So if you don't believe the gravestone, go and have a look at the birth certificate. The two Caldwell boys were both ducks at Kirkcudbright Academy, Malcolm in 1949 and David in 1951. Isabel, the daughter, was married in Kirkcudbright to a William Peter Cahoon and died in 2001 in Lewes, Sussex. David was a notable athlete. He was also an enthusiastic participant in the local drama group, and this time of year, I reckon he'd have been getting ready for the pantomime. He died in Farringdon in Oxfordshire in his 60s. Beyond that, I've been able to find out very little about them, although I have met David's son and learned a few things from him. But Malcolm is different. If you Google Malcolm Campbell, or the other search engines are available, you will find no end of choice of things to read. Here he is. He studied at Edinburgh University, where he took a first-class honours degree in economics, and he went on to do a PhD at Nottingham before successfully interviewing for a post at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And the story is that the School of Oriental and African Studies were thrilled to get this very clever and well-qualified new lecturer. Malcolm turned up with wild long hair. He did wear a suit, but it tended to be an Oxfam suit that was not in the best of conditions. And some of his ideas, as we'll hear, were wild. I really don't know when his political and economic theories were formulated, whether it was during his time at school here in Kirkcudbright or during his student days, but his politics were very definitely of the left. He stood unsuccessfully as a Labour councillor in London. He was the chair of CND, the Committee on Nuclear Disarmament, for 2 years. He contributed regularly to Peace News. But as we'll hear in more detail from Gerry, there were areas where his political views went much further than these organisations. He was deeply hostile to the USA. He wrote extensively in defence of regimes that most people considered indefensible, and with the benefit of hindsight, now do so even more. These included the North Korean government of Kim Il-sung and the Pol Pot government in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge. Malcolm Campbell was partisan and polemical. He didn't allow evidence to get in the way of his political opinions. His writings aroused a storm of opposition, and his path up the salary ladder at the School of Oriental and African Studies was blocked on the grounds that his scholarship was suspect. Undoubtedly, there were areas of thought in which we can say he was ahead of his time. Notably, his criticism of the wastefulness of Western society. A Guardian article about him says his analysis of world resource consumption patterns attempted to show that the liberation of all peoples ultimately requires reconstructing the consumption patterns of the rich countries towards an economy compatible with the preservation of the earth and with norms of human equality. Now that's a commonplace view today. It wasn't so commonplace in the late 60s, early 70s. The same article calls him a lone heretic in the academic world of enormous personal charm, who was respected internationally for views which many colleagues failed to understand. It also gives us a flavour of his passion, his energy, and his interests. And that's useful because he doesn't seem to have left a heavy footprint in Kirkcudbright. I have asked around a lot, and I've not really come across anyone who remembers him to any degree at all. But the article says he was an exceptionally persuasive speaker, speaking with a Scottish eloquence, punctuated with bursts of humour. He was capable of giving 3 lectures in one day, even in 3 different cities, and still have the energy for drinking beer, of which he was very fond, along with cricket, jazz, and poetry. And I would ask you to keep that in mind as you hear some of the indefensible causes that he espoused and some of the appalling regimes that he supported. I don't think I ever met him. There's just a possibility that I may have done when I was about 6 or 7. But it's a very vague memory, and it might be totally wrong. But I think that if we'd followed the traditional advice to keep away from politics and religion, he and I could have spent quite a pleasant afternoon at Trent Bridge over a couple of pints watching a game of cricket. And I do know from family records that his relationship with his mother, my great-aunt Violet Jane, Auntie Pansy, if I can be forgiven for calling her that, was a really close and loving one. Students speak of his personal charm, of his willingness to spend any amount of time with them, of his supportiveness. So let me ask you to bear that in mind as I invite Gerry to tell us the other side of Malcolm Caldwell. Thank you, Graham. 20 minutes.
Thank you, Graham. I come to Malcolm Caldwell from a very different route. When I moved to Kirkcudbright, I was asked to contribute to this book by Ian Dale, 64 dictators, 64 authors, 64 warnings from history. And you got a choice of all the greats, you know, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, Mussolini. And I think I knew the Malcolm Caldwell Pol Pot connection. Yes, I knew it through the wiki entry of the town, where Malcolm Caldwell is listed as one of the notable people that grew up in Kirkcudbright. And it just grew from there. It was such a great connection. And it's a connection to, I've just said to a few people frivolously beforehand, to practically all are some of the milestones of post-1945 global history, some of the great conflicts across this earth he was involved in. And it's one that resonates to this day. As Graham was saying, Google Malcolm Caldwell and you will find a whole world, rabbit holes of article after article, studious, scholarly, and some not so studious. And 3 descriptions of Caldwell that I just found. These are 3 random ones that are damning of Caldwell. One of the staunchest defenders of the Pol Pot regime in the West, a timeless Khmer Rouge defender, and what was called, the country was called then, Democratic Kampuchea's leading academic supporter. But really, apart from the man that is behind that, because there's a man and a human being behind those views, How did this come about? What does it actually mean then and now? And what was Caldwell's role in some of these big issues? So this is a very, very potted three-slide history of things very complicated. This is French Indochina. And in this, post-1945, France controls the countries of French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The Japanese had controlled it during the Second World War when they pushed the French out. The French come back, and the French find themselves in a bitter dispute with the Vietnamese, and in particular the North Vietnamese. And so these are about big things that are Caldwell is motivated by. It's about decolonization, the retreat, the brutal retreat of empire, the French Empire here. It's about national liberation movements, the North Vietnamese in particular, who are hugely important in the next 3-4 decades. It's about the Cold War, because the Cold War a way to start, and it's not just the Americans, it's not just the Russians, it's the role of the Chinese. And there's the issue of anti-imperialism, and a tradition Caldwell saw himself in, which involves lots and lots of really noble people and principled people, but which, as you'll see, Caldwell took to quite a bit of an extreme. So this is what happened when the French withdrew. The French suffer a huge, huge, humiliating defeat in 1954 at the hands of the North Vietnamese, and they withdraw. And in the peace agreement, Vietnam is split into two countries, North and South Vietnam, along the 17th parallel, just like what happened with North Korea the year before, and is divided to this day. And the Russians and the Soviets and the Chinese back the North Vietnamese, and the Americans become the underwriters of South Vietnam. And this conflict goes very quickly from being cold to hot. And it's one that is, a very, very bitter one. And in that, it's on the map, this thing called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, it's named after the North Vietnam leader, is a way in which the North Vietnamese come into South Vietnam to undermine that regime. And it's a long trail of supplies and troops. And it comes, as you can see, through particularly Cambodia. The Americans spend years bombing it with horrendous, what are basic war crimes and crimes against humanity in terms of the chemical weapons they use, but they never stop it. And that undermines the South Vietnamese. And this action is led by there's many American presidents involved in the Vietnam War, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson. Nixon was elected in 1968, decides to escalate the war to end it in strength, words you've heard many times. And so he decides in 1970 to invade Cambodia, to tackle the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and also to bomb it to the extent they're bombing North Vietnam. So this has all sorts of consequences. Thousands of deaths in Cambodia, destabilizes the Cambodian regime. And this is where it sort of links to Malcolm Caldwell, because what it does is that the Kampuchean Communist Party, who are a tiny little group, this is the group known as Khmer Rouge, as they become when they come to power, they become more powerful. They become a more potent guerrilla force in such febrile, unstable circumstances. And so that leads to, there's two things that happen. This is a famous moment in history. This is the fall of Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, on April the 30th, 1975. And this is the most famous shot of it. This is the American embassy, and these are people who've worked for the American forces, etc., and supported American things going on, trying to get one of the last helicopters out. And this day is a huge defeat for America, huge humiliation. It's a point in history they never really got over, and led to all sorts of other things. How America stood up to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, etc. 58,000 Americans lost their lives in the Vietnam War, something that was mourned by America. 3 million Vietnamese lost their lives as a result of the American action. 3 million. which is like, I don't know how many more times that is. But at the same time Saigon fell, something happened in Kampuchea. This is the fall of the capital city of Cambodia, Phnom Penh, 2 weeks before, April the 17th, 1975. So the North Vietnamese capture Saigon. The forces entering Phnom Penh are the Kampuchean Communist Party, who you think might be sisters and brothers of the Vietnamese communists, but they're not, because there's some things run deeper than like being of a similar political persuasion. These are two forces that have very little solidarity with each other. And so the capturing of Phnom Penh by the Khmer Rouge, Khmer meaning red, is again another huge moment that's going to have destabilizing effects on a country that has already been through, saturation American bombing, an invasion sitting next to the ongoing Vietnam War. And this is the Pol Pot and Khmer Rouge leadership. I know it looks like someone from Reservoir Dogs or something. And the person on the left, that is Pol Pot. Now, Pol Pot wasn't even his real name. Pol Pot is a creation. His real name is Saloth Sar. And he's Paris-educated, like a lot of this leadership was, because, French colony it was. Influenced by French communists and French communism, hugely influenced by Stalin and all that, and also by the Chinese revolutionary leader Mao. And there's also an undercurrent in lots of the quotes of their documents. They're majorly influenced by the French Revolution. They regard the terror of the French Revolution and its Puritanism as a model for them. And that takes them into some pretty horrendous places. So here's back to Malcolm Caldwell, as Graham said, educated, Edinburgh and Nottingham universities. He did do 2 years national service because, the 50s, people did national service. So in that, he becomes a sergeant in the Army Education Corps. And he then joins, as Graham said, the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, as it was known, 1959. First as a research fellow, 1962 as a lecturer. And his specialist area, an area it becomes a well-published, known international scholar on, is Southeast Asia and economic history. The Southeast Asia economic history. And the issue, I think, the missing part in all this, for me, that you can't find in all these articles on Caldwell, is what radicalized Malcolm Caldwell. What made him this person that went to extremes? And we haven't really got that in any of these like scholarly articles and lengthy articles on Caldwell. It seems to be in part his studying of economic history and the economic history of post-imperialism, of empires, and the brutality that was going on in the world. The context of the times, those words, decolonization, him believing, to an extreme extent, in anti-imperialism. And that search for a different economic model, which was a virtuous thing to do, but taking it to absolute extremes and to a degree that was not of mainstream radical opinion, either academically or just in the world. And so he is involved in mainstream politics, CND, at a point when CND's fortunes are a little bit on the wane in the 60s. And so he wrote this pamphlet. And he also wrote this book at the time. This is his first book on the area. And that book was quite significantly criticised when it came out. Not that this stopped him. He was accused widely of academic plagiarism and also of selective use of facts. But at this time, when he's chair of CND and developing, a reputation for being a radical, many people would speak well of him. So when he's chair of CND, after that, the person that follows him, John Cox, says he was well in the mainstream of what I would call generally progressive thinking. I don't think that's true. I think that's a kind of like political memory. I think that's a kind of nostalgic view of the 60s. He is what people would call ultra-left. And when he stands for a Labour Council to be a Labour Council candidate in Bexley in 1977. He loses, and he never gets any further. He is what would be called people, he's a kind of entryist into the Labour Party from the far left. But at the same time, this is Caldwell in 1969 with the chap in the middle is a person called Tariq Ali, who goes on to be a very well-known media figure, revolutionary sort of activist campaigner. And Ali is 12 years the junior of Caldwell, and in many senses Caldwell mentors him, and they have a deep political relationship and a deep friendship that has a light, thankfully, a light side to it as well as a kind of other side. And so while they're obsessed with Vietnam, which a lot of people were, this was the cause célèbre of the late 60s, early 70s, one of their driving forces of conversations to talk about opening in London a North Vietnamese restaurant. They're going to run as a business together. And they call it, they say it's going to be this meeting point as an anti-war gastro property. There'll be the cause célèbre of all the greats to come to. So there's a kind of nice side to that. No one, despite their views, is always completely just saying those views. And Ali described Caldwell, he said he was a great whiskey drinker. He was also a great cricket fan. He loved just talking about cricket, and he knew that was quite unusual in Scotland, and so on. And he was an early Scottish nationalist. Now, there's no writing of Caldwell's anywhere on Scottish nationalism, but it has been said by a couple of people that knew him well, that at times, if a little bit drunk, he would compare the state of Cambodia and its underdevelopment to Scotland in the 1970s, which I think is a little bit excessive as well. But he did, and there's one funny American article this way, it says he postulated very, very extreme views, such as that Scotland in the future might become independent, although he did predict it by 1980, so he was wrong on that. And Tariq Ali says about, this touches with Graham's point about the son of a miner. Ali says, we never bothered about those things, i.e. our backgrounds. We were so totally immersed in politics and the state of the world. We never really talked about each other, our personal lives, or our social backgrounds. And we all know conversations and people like that. Caldwell's not on his own on that. So this is a photograph of North Korean women guards. So Caldwell travelled the world preaching revolution, a mixture of academia and activism. He visited Malaya, 1963 to 1964, Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam, 1966 to 1967, that's the height of the war, Singapore, 1970 to 71, where he was banned by the authorities because of his connections with local subversives. He visited China, 1973, and North Korea in 1975. This is a later photograph. But in North Korea, again, he found a utopia. Someone's described Caldwell's finding heaven in hell, which I don't know how accurate that is, but it's a good phrase. And so Caldwell praises North Korea. He says it's all-round economic achievements, its correct line. And this very astute political analysis, he observes that, this is a direct quote, the female military uniform is quite attractive. It's got a fitted tunic and pleated skirt. So clearly, in some ways, he was a man of his age. And this is what happens when the Khmer Rouge take hold of Cambodia, and a society that's already been through quite a lot of pain and suffering. This is the forced evacuation of the capital city of Phnom Penh, which began in April 1975, the moment they take charge. And people can ask, why did they do that? And there's a couple of reasons for it. But the Khmer Rouge were a rural guerrilla force who saw the cities as places of subversion, counter-revolution, espionage, and enemy agents. So it's again the purify point, the contamination of bad ideas, and wanting to put those people out of that area to regain control. And this is what Phnom Penh looked like under their rule. Basically, what's called a ghost town. And I'll talk about these two people just in a minute in terms of the death of Caldwell. So in 1978, December 1978, Elizabeth Becker and Richard Dudman, two American journalists, they visit with Caldwell Phnom Penh. And Dudwell said the city had the eerie quiet of a dead place, a Hiroshima without the destruction, a Pompeii without the ashes. And Elizabeth Becker said, as they walked around, there were few, next to no food stalls, no families, no young people playing sports, not even dogs or cats playing in the alleyways. And the Khmer Rouge did this. They feared the city and people in the cities and all that, and they also wanted to force the people into the countryside because, again, it's a good idea taken to, I mean, just grotesque proportions. They believed that Cambodia should become self-sufficient in food, and the way to do that was to massively increase food production, and to do that, they would drive the urban population into the countryside to increase the labour force. So they did this without asking people their permission. It's a forced labour. They often didn't pay people because it was for the revolution, so it was basically a form of slave labour. So it's a kernel of a tiny good idea taken to, you know, horrendous points. Now, one defence put forward of Malcolm Caldwell is, who knew all this? You know, these could have been good guys, you know, as the story goes. How were we to know? It's a story said throughout time. Well, this book, Cambodia, Year Zero, was published in French in 1977 when Pol Pot's running Cambodia, published in English in January 1978. It documented systematically the crimes of Pol Pot. It's dismissed by Noam Chomsky, who is a great ally of Caldwell. At the time, in a review, Caldwell dismisses his book without ever reading it, based on the Chomsky review. So Caldwell knew there was critics, people systematically recording the crimes of Pol Pot. And here's the other book of the same time, this Murder of a Gentle Land. This is a book by two Reader's Digest journalists. It was dismissed by lots of people at the time as just being anecdotal, etc., but it contains a volume of hard evidence of the eyewitness accounts of people seeing terror and people seeing the systematic killings. This is even more dismissed by people like Chomsky and Caldwell. And this is Noam Chomsky, who's still about. And Chomsky is like one of the huge figures of the last 50, 60 years intellectually, absolute pioneer in linguistics, and a huge critic of American foreign policy. He believed the suffering of Cambodia was about American action and then the legacy of that. The American bombing and invasion had destabilized that society, and those are the crimes we should focus on. He keeps to this day. And this brings us to the trip. This is, on the left, Richard Dudman, and then Elizabeth Becker, their Cambodian guide, and Malcolm Caldwell. This photograph's obviously December 1978. It's right by the Vietnamese border, where something, invasions about to happen. And this is them. This is them at the Angkor Wat temple. And this is Caldwell with one of his Cambodian guides. Now, I should say as well that in the many accounts of Malcolm Caldwell, Graham's alluded to this as well, many people talk about his charm. Elizabeth Becker, who I'm away to give you some damning testimony about Caldwell, described him as, even in Cambodia, as a complete sweetie. She said, you could have a lovely big argument with him about the Khmer Rouge, and then they'd have a great big laugh about, cricket or so on. There were many sides to this man, like there are to many of us. And so on the events of December the 22nd, 23rd, 1978, just before we were away to tuck into, Morecambe and Wise and Bonnie M at number 1, Malcolm Caldwell gets an early Christmas present when they are told, with 1 day left of their visit, they are to get an audience with Pol Pot, the leader of this regime. Pol Pot was not a man who actually believed in the personality cult, etc. It was a very, very different kind of terror. And he didn't often meet international visitors. And this is, on the record anyway, the first time Pol Pot ever met someone from the UK. And as far as we know, the only time he met someone from the UK while he was leading his countries. The two Americans met Pol Pot first, and then Caldwell goes to meet Pol Pot on his own. And Caldwell has intense discussions over several hours with Pol Pot and comes back and tells Becker he was elated. It was better than he could have ever imagined. So that's December the 22nd, 1978. They all have a meal together, go to bed by 11 p.m. As the day comes into the next morning, at 1 a.m. in the morning, the three of them are staying in a guest house where they're locked into it by the Khmer Rouge because they're not free to go where they want, etc. Shots are heard. Elizabeth Becker wakes up and finds a young man pointing a gun at her. She retreats into her room and runs into her bathroom where she locks herself in. Richard Dudman, he wakes up hearing the shots, the second person to wake up. He knocks on Caldwell's door, checks on him, exchanges a few words with him, and then an armed man approaches who shoots at the four. As a result, Dudman retreats into his own room. 2 shots are fired at his door that just go into the door. The 2 Americans remain in their rooms for the next hour, scared to move, petrified, not knowing what is going on. A Cambodian aide then comes and tells them to stay where they are. This is 1 hour into the incident happening. Another hour passes before Becker is then allowed to come out. When she comes out, she is told that Caldwell's dead, he has been shot, he's in his bedroom, fully clothed, never went to bed, etc. And what happened. Now, in this is one of the many points that make Caldwell's story so interesting and have ramifications to this day. Who shot Malcolm Caldwell and why? This is a question which, as we're going to find out, there is no conclusive answer, and we're going to return to leave you with a little, a lighter note in the sense of the who done it. Now, what happens after that? That's December the 23rd. Within 48 hours, this happens. The Vietnamese, because remember, the Vietnamese communists and the Cambodian communists don't get on, and there's bigger, longer historical rivalries and tensions. They invade Cambodia, and they capture Phnom Penh. They overthrow the Khmer Rouge. Now, there's a longer story that can't go into here, which is that Pol Pot doesn't completely go away. Pol Pot retreats to the mountains and ends up, because my enemy's enemy is my friend, Pol Pot for a decade is supported as a guerrilla force by the Chinese, the Americans, and the UK government under Margaret Thatcher, including things like the SAS trained Pol Pot forces. That was broken as a scandal by The Guardian in the 80s. So, there's now as strange as folk in politics. So there's nobody coming out of this very well. But there's issues about what was the relationship between this, which initially is a liberation, but again, it doesn't remain as simple as that for long. That action and the murder of Caldwell. And here, just a few final observations. Here's Elizabeth Becker. So she writes a book, 1986, when the war was over. This has actually been made into a film this year called Meeting with Pol Pot, which has been released in France in June, but is yet awaiting a UK release. So there's a future one for the History Society, And Becker says of Caldwell, she said, he didn't want to know about problems with the Khmer Rouge, and that carried over to not wanting to know about problems between Cambodia and Vietnam. That was another truth that Caldwell just didn't want to know about. He was stuck in 1968. She means by that, stuck in some romantic era of kind of revolutionary rhetoric. And here's how the story continues to this day. This is 2010. The Observer run an exhaustive essay on Caldwell, on his life and times, Lost in Cambodia it's called, that goes through Caldwell's views, the events of December 22nd, 23rd. And it's an impressive piece of journalism by Andrew Anthony. Yet, the week after that, in the Observer, there's a pile of letters saying that how nice Caldwell was and he was just really out for the forces of good. There's Chomsky saying in 2010, all this talking about Caldwell and Pol Pot is about the West evading our own crimes. It's us that are the guilty ones. There's Richard Gott from the Guardian saying that how was Malcolm Caldwell meant to know the true crimes of Pol Pot in the 70s when just several books actually on the subject. And there's his relative, Sue Caldwell, who Malcolm is her uncle, said the whole thing is a smear linking anti-imperialism to communist tyranny. And so here's just as the last couple of things. Bernard Levin, some of you might have remembered, Malcolm Caldwell wrote an article in the Times and it produced this response from Bernard Levin, 10th of May 1978. And Levin, in this powerful rhetoric he had, said, which I think has resonance to this day, the truth is there's a Caldwell, or there are several Caldwells for every tyrant, every murderer, every oppressor or torturer who acts in the name of a political creed. That was Bernard Levin, 1978. And the wounds of Cambodia live on. Pol Pot's regime only existed, this regime that still has ramifications from April 1975 to January 1979. Yet, that 1975 Cambodian population of only 7.8 million people, the Khmer Rouge killed at least 2 million people, at least because we don't know the exact number, at least that's 26% of the population, including 33% of all Cambodian men. Now, Caldwell didn't care about such killing and violence. He thought it was for a greater good, you know that. And he's not only a warning from the past, but look today at Syria, Ukraine, Gaza, all sorts of places in the world. There's people still excusing evil done because they think it's done for a greater good. So Caldwell isn't just a warning from the past, he's a warning for the present and the future. So rather than leave it on that note, what we thought we'd do is we're now going to pose the question, who killed Malcolm Caldwell? So let's make it a bit lighter to Graham.
Have you got the differ? Okay. Before we tackle that question, I thought you might like to hear how the Galloway News reported the death of Malcolm Campbell, because where else are we likely to find the real truth? This appears on the Galloway News of Friday, the 29th of December, 1978, on the same page as much bigger headlines reporting trip to strip shop leads to ban and Dalbeattie flood alert as burn rises. A Kirkcudbright man and former pupil of the local academy has been murdered in Phnom Penh in Cambodia. Dr. Malcolm Caldwell, who was an expert on Asian economic history and lectured at the School of Oriental and African Studies at London University, was shot dead by gunmen who attacked the government guest house where he was staying. His death was described as a political crime committed by the enemies of Cambodia's revolution in a statement issued by the Cambodian embassy in Peking on Tuesday. The statement said that Dr. Caldwell was a progressive personage who had sympathy with democratic Kampuchea and had carried successive activities to support the struggle of Kampuchea's people. He was educated at Kirkcudbright Academy and Edinburgh University, where he graduated with first-class honours in economics. He was married twice and his second wife lives in London. His father, the late Mr. Archibald Campbell, was the Stewart Tray County architect from 1938 to the mid-50s and was responsible for designing the County Council's crest and flag. Dr. Caldwell's body was flown to Peking on the day of his death, and the British Embassy officials said arrangements were being made for its removal to Britain. So who took the life of this Kirkcudbright boy so far from home, and why? There is no satisfactory explanation, but there are plenty of theories. Tension was running high between Cambodia and Vietnam. Vietnam sent in a major invasion force 2 days later. And there are those who blame pro-Vietnamese dissidents trying to make trouble in the West for Pol Pot. Some people think that Pol Pot had said something during his conversation with Malcolm Caldwell which he wished he hadn't said. And the easiest way to make it unsaid was to have the person who heard it killed. That would not have been untypical. But the evidence of the translator doesn't support it. He says it was a very amicable and positive conversation in which nothing untoward was said. There are those who argue that Malcolm Caldwell had seen and heard enough in Cambodia to make him change his mind, and that Pol Pot didn't want one of his staunchest supporters in the West to do that. But that's contradicted by the evidence of Elizabeth Becker, that on the night after the meeting, Caldwell was still enthusiastically backing the regime. And Becker's view is supported by the notebooks that Caldwell kept on his trip, where there's no trace of any criticism of the Khmer Rouge regime. His brother David wrote a letter to the Times, suggesting that Malcolm had changed his mind, but needed to keep up the pretense of supporting Pol Pot as long as he was still in Cambodia. There's no real evidence for that. His son Richard, interviewed in 2010, takes a similar line. My father believed in going back to the land and people being self-sufficient. We all know now, looking back, that he was supporting a terrible regime, but he didn't know it at the time. I am sure he would have been horrified if he had known. I have to say, I take that with a pinch of salt. That may have been what happened. He found out, and they killed him because of it. As if that wasn't complicated enough, there are many people who wonder why it is that it was Malcolm Caldwell who supported the regime who took the bullet when he was the sympathizer and the apologist, when the two Americans who were suspected of spying for the CIA came home unscathed. Two Khmer Rouge soldiers were bayoneted to death, having allegedly confessed to the murder. They're described in the records of the trial as the contemptible Fionn and the contemptible Chan. But they give contradictory reasons for the killing, and Becker discounts their evidence, claiming that it would have been obtained under torture. Some are more inclined to give it some credence. There's a suggestion that one of them was having marital problems and was depressed and just fancied taking it out on somebody. But Caldwell's death seems to me to have been targeted. A random killer would just as soon had killed the Americans. Some think that Malcolm Caldwell went to a dangerously unstable place at a dangerously unstable time and suffered the consequences, and that's maybe as near to the truth as we will ever get. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, we'll try and answer them.
Are you happy to take questions?
Yes, indeed, yes.
Do you want to come up? Yeah. David has a roving mic, so if you have a question, let David come to you with a mic so the people on Zoom can hear the question. So do you have any questions then for... Yes, right at the front here, David.
Has anybody suggested that the British or the Americans might have had something to do with taking him out?
No.
No. So that's never been a theory?
That's never been suggested to my knowledge, and it might have been easier to do over here if they'd wanted to do that.
I was saying to Graham earlier today that, you know, there's as many theories as is possible on this. One, there's a Japanese news account from 1981 that identifies a senior Khmer Rouge official as being the person in charge of that operation. But what we've got is it's an account where the information is got through torture. You've also got to remember the Khmer Rouge regime was despotic. There was all sorts of infighting and positioning going on. So one has to take one account from them, reported by in Japanese media, with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, they were all watching their back all the time.
Thank you. Any more? No more questions? Right, thank you. Joyce, could I ask you to give us a vote of thanks, please? David? David, could you give Joyce the thanks?